Bioshock was released in 2007 by Irrational Games, headed by creative director Ken Levine to great acclaim, thanks to its world setting, shocking story, and ability to present players with philosophy as had never been done before. It's set in the science fiction version of 1960, in the biblically named city of Rapture, built on the bottom of the ocean, intended to be an objectivist haven for the world's greatest minds before it succumbed to internal strife. Rapture's founder, Andrew Ryan, is both a cipher and anagram of the real-world figure Ayn Rand, who developed the philosophical system of Objectivism, so much of what Ryan extols is extrapolated from her writings. The game first introduces Ryan in the form of a grandiose golden bust sneering down with a banner, "No gods or kings, only man." A plaque with a quotation attributed to him reads, "In what country is there a place for people like me?" Then below are 3 seals presenting the founding virtues of his city: science, industry, and art. Nothing pertaining to governance or values, simply 3 objective pursuits that would be of the utmost importance. During the descent to Rapture, we are presented a recording of Ryan's rationale for its creation, with an introduction to his ideology, which would have been seen by any newcomers to the city.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well.
Its location and residents isolated from the rest of the world, Rapture was the promise of an individualist utopia free from government intervention. The system is one of anarcho-capitalism, a total laissez-faire without regulation, idealizing self-determination, meritocracy, and freedom from moral, governmental, or religious controls, as well as enforced collectivism. Without government, there's nothing to falter personal aspirations, no state to exploit its citizens through taxation, no sprawling code of laws to obey, and nothing to disincentivize the exploitation of others, or even the system itself. All bets are placed upon the citizens' enlightened self-interest as free agents, voluntarily collaborating, participating in society, and observing the golden rule. In this chapter, I'll define Objectivism and show the similarities between Rand's life and that of Ryan's, how that led to their philosophies and what their philosophies did to them. Objectivism is a philosophical framework or formula to live by, constructed from 4 main principles.
1. Metaphysics, objective reality. 2. Epistemology, reason. 3. Ethics, self-interest. 4. Politics, capitalism.
In other words, firstly, the certainty that there is an objective reality that exists outside of the ability of human perception. Any interaction with reality is therefore filtered through your subjective interpretation and further assessed by your desires. Secondly is reason, which is a culmination of your subjective perception of reality, minus any emotion or second-order ideas. Thirdly is rational self-interest, or ethical egoism, which states that it is most moral to firstly consider oneself and reject universal systems of morality, such as utilitarianism. But, to clarify, self-interest must follow the tenets of integrity, productivity, pride, honesty, rationality, independence, and justice. The limiting factor to one's self-interest is the aspect of rationality. For example, that if your actions infringe upon someone else's interests, you should expect them to act reciprocally. Fourthly and finally, laissez-faire capitalism is held up as the paragonal economic system, because it emphasises the separation of government. The whole basis of the philosophy is egoism, which is placed as absolutely antithetical to altruism.
The destroyer is the morality of altruism. Altruism holds that man has no right to exist for his own sake, that service to others is the only moral justification of his existence, and that self-sacrifice is his highest moral duty. The political expression of altruism is collectivism or statism, which holds that man's life and work belong to the state, to society, to the group, the gang, the race, the nation, and that the state may dispose of him in any way it pleases for the sake of whatever it deems to be its own tribal collective good.
Any collectivizing ideas such as society, race, or nation are rejected along with altruism. So not only are collectivist state systems like communism or democratic socialism no good, but also any form of society that puts an emphasis or requirement on ties of identity or beliefs other than those espoused by objectivism. It's quicker therefore not to continue listing which forms of society or state aren't preferred, as anything beyond the economic system of capitalism is rejected outright. The emphasis against altruism and statism references events recent to the time of Rand's writing, with the claim being that the outcome of such a mix of ideas is always the commodification and destruction of humans as capital.
You may observe the practical results of altruism and statism all around us in today's world, such as the slave labor camps of Soviet Russia, where 21 million political prisoners work on the construction of government projects and die of planned malnutrition, human life being cheaper than food, or the gas chambers and mass slaughter of Nazi Germany, or the terror and starvation of Red China, or the hysteria of Cuba, where the government offers men for sale, or the wall of East Berlin, where human beings leap from roofs or crawl through sewers in order to escape, while guards shoot at fleeing children.
Now it's worth putting Rand's views into context with her early life through to her time as the leader of the Objectivist movement. She was born as Alisa Zinovievna in the Russian Empire, 1905, 1 month after the so-called First Russian Revolution, to a bourgeois Jewish family living in the capital city, St. Petersburg, as the eldest of 3 girls. Her father, as she later described, was a self-made man who owned a small business, which was unusual for Russia. So, in 1914 they were able to afford a trip through Europe, travelling westward until stopping in France, when the Great War broke out. The journey back to Russia was perilous, with a ship in front of theirs striking a sea mine before reaching St. Petersburg. Then, in 1917, the October Revolution occurred and the subsequent Bolshevik rule threatened her family's livelihood, with her father's pharmacy being nationalised. For a time they lived in Crimea until returning to the city seemed feasible, by which point she's graduated high school, in a final year of which included study and American history. It was around this age she became politically conscious, having had sympathies with a less bloody February Revolution, which championed freedom. She was displeased with what had become of the October Revolution, however, with a civil war and the full communist regime coming about afterwards. As she also said of her father, quote, "In childhood I had very little to do with him. It's after we began to be political allies that I really felt any love for him." Unquote. And in regards to her mother, they did not get along so well because of her being antisocial in her eyes. In fact, her mother would sometimes cry having had to look after children at all, which Rand rationalised by thinking, "We did not choose to be born, and what is it that we are expected to do about it?" So, considering herself as the smartest pupil of both schools she had attended, she left for university as soon as possible. For being considered part of the bourgeoisie, she and some other students were removed from university before completing their courses, but thanks to an intervention from a body of foreign students, was able to return and complete a major in history. In 1926, having successfully applied for a US visa thanks to some relatives already living in America, she emigrated and eventually got work as a screenwriter in Hollywood, marrying an American man and gaining permanent residency in 1931. The two eventually settled down in New York in 1934, where she would go on to develop her own works in philosophy. We can see then how Rand's formative years were a struggle, and that she was strongly drawn to independence and personal success. Bring her to America, where she would raise such ideals to utopian ends. Rand's fiction and non-fiction books, essays and interviews then made up the collected works that defined her philosophy, Objectivism. Two such works are The Fountainhead, published 1943, and Atlas Shrugged, published 1957. These, in many ways, served as the primary sources of inspiration for the characters and setting of Bioshock. Between the publication of these two books, Rand formed a clique, which some later called a cult, that aimed to live by her radically individualistic ideals, though they jokingly called themselves the Collective. Atlas Shrugged was to be her last fiction story, deciding instead to work with a collective to develop and spread Objectivism. One of them, Nathaniel Brandon, had set up an institute in his name, and with Rand unwilling to commit to lecturing, he took up that role instead. It was with Nathaniel whom she then had an affair with, despite Nathaniel's wife Barbara also being a member of the collective. However, they did so openly, with Rand citing her rational self-interest.
Ayn Rand thought that she was being rational about anything or everything that she did. So it would never occur to me to ask, did Ayn Rand think she was being rational about that? She would say, if she were here, I can feel her, she would say, why, yes, do you think I would do something if I didn't think it was rational?
But sometime later, their relationship broke down when Brandon himself cheated with a younger woman. Rand then attacked his character,
accusing him of utter irrationality, of betraying Objectivism, betraying her, and ultimately ended it in absolute disaster for everybody.
Naturally, the collective fell apart. The Nathaniel Brandon Institute closed its doors, and one Leonard Peikoff took up the role of the primary lecturer and associate editor of the Objectivist newsletter. This newsletter had been publicised with the input of all the collective and other authors, but after a few years was replaced simply by the Ayn Rand letter, consisting mostly of her own ideas with some of Leonard Peikoff's. Rand kept producing work in relative isolation, but had permitted others to carry on her legacy when she died in 1982.
Don't you understand that when this life is finished, you're not there to say, oh, how terrible that I'm a corpse. No.
Well, this is true.
It's finished. And what I've always thought, I will not die. It's the world that will end. And that's absolutely true.
What is the difference between a man and a parasite? A man builds, a parasite asks, where's my share? A man creates, a parasite says, what will the neighbors think? A man invents, a parasite says, watch out, or you might tread on the toes of God.
Similar to Rand, Andrew Ryan's fictional life began in Minsk, the capital city of Belarus, also part of the Russian Empire at the time. Born to a Jewish family, his birth name was Andrei Ryanovsky. During the Great War, he was put in danger as a front line moved closer to Minsk. In 1917, the October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks into power, destroying the family business. The Red Guard executed his aunt and uncle in the midst of a purge, as well as opponents of the communist regime and other complete innocents. Subsequently, he and his father fled to Constantinople, capital of the Ottoman Empire, now Istanbul, Turkey. In 1919, he left for America and anglicised his name to Andrew Ryan, believing that it was the land of opportunity where great men could prosper without the rule of parasites. His wit and determination enabled him to get by fairly well, but his prospects struck lucky upon finding an oil deposit beneath his property, the profits from which he successfully invested and built with it Ryan Oil. He also came to own much of the coal industry and operated the second largest railroad, becoming one of the richest men in America. This had indeed contented him and assured his vision of America, that is, until the 1930s, when Franklin D. Roosevelt began to implement state social programs of workers' rights, wealth distribution, and financial reform. This was called the New Deal, which headlined with the phrase, "Relief for the unemployed and for the poor." Having experienced socialist policy taken to the extreme, Ryan soured on the direction America was taking. There was a particularly heated spat over a large tract of forest he owned, which a religious group petitioned to make a public park, the government then attempting to officially nationalise as parkland. In response, Ryan simply burned it all to the ground. Come 1945, President Roosevelt took on an unprecedented fourth term in office, but died early in the year, being succeeded by President Harry S. Truman, a man of the same ilk. Truman ended the Second World War with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, something Ryan saw as a final corruption of the ideals he had developed alongside America, and of science, which had been abused by the parasites for their destructive ends, feeling that they would now simply destroy anything that they could not take control of themselves. Subsequently, Ryan began a speedy construction of Rapture, his underwater city, at a secret location somewhere on the seabed of the North Atlantic. First opening up to select individuals in 1946, it grew and prospered for over a decade before imperfections in its citizens, system, and leader began to appear.
What is the greatest lie ever created? What is the most vicious obscenity ever perpetrated on mankind? Slavery, the Holocaust, dictatorship. No, it's the tool with which all that wickedness is built. Altruism. Whenever anyone wants others to do their work, they call upon their altruism. Never mind your own needs, they say. Think of the needs of whoever. The state, the poor, of the army, of the king, of God. The list goes on and on. How many catastrophes were launched with the words, think of yourself? It's the king and country crowd who light the torch of destruction. It is this great inversion, this ancient lie, which has chained humanity to an endless cycle of guilt and failure. My journey to rapture was my second exodus. In 1919, I fled a country that had been traded in despotism or insanity. The Marxist revolution simply traded one lie for another. Instead of one man, the Tsar, owning the work of all the people own the work of all of the people. And so, I came to America, where a man could own his own work, where a man could benefit from the brilliance of his own mind, the strength of his own muscles, the might of his own will. I had thought I had left the parasites of Moscow behind me. I had thought I had left the Marxist altruists to their collective farms and their 5-year plans. But as the German fools threw themselves on Hitler's sword for the good of the Reich, the Americans drank deeper and deeper Bolshevik poison, spoon-fed to them by Roosevelt and his New Deals. And so, I asked myself, in what country was there a place for men like me? Men who refused to say yes to the parasites and the doubters. Men who believed that work was sacred and property rights inviolate. And then, one day, the happy answer came to me, my friends. There was no country for people like me. And that was the moment I decided to build one.
Despite Rapture's isolation, a spiralling series of events between two great men would lead to Rapture society collapsing into civil war by 1960. For the remainder of this part, we'll look into how that occurred by stitching together the pertinent elements of the game's story chronologically, prior to and during the Civil War.
To build a city at the bottom of the sea, insanity. But where else could we be free from the clutching hand of the parasites? Where else could we build an economy that they would not try to control, a society that they would not try to destroy? It was not impossible to build rapture at the bottom of the sea. It was impossible to build it anywhere else.
Andrew Ryan had an ever-growing sense of paranoia, fearing that parasites may attempt to come and ruin his creation. So, from day one, he alone controls communication and travel between the city and the surface, claiming all that Rapture society and economy needs is within its walls.
I believe in no God, no invisible man in the sky. But there is something more powerful than each of us, a combination of our efforts, a great chain of industry that unites us. But it is only when we struggle in our own interest that the chain pulls society in the right direction. The chain is too powerful and too mysterious for any government to guide. Any man who tells you different either has his hand in your pocket or a pistol to your neck.
In a fateful irony, however, he personally invites in one Frank Fontaine, presenting as a fishery owner, but in reality a conman and arch-criminal, specialising in smuggling and assuming false identities. Once in Rapture, Fontaine began smuggling operations to and from the surface, using custom-made fishing submarines as cover and the means.
I'm closing in on the whole ring. I'd pat myself on the back, but let's face it, these aren't exactly bloodthirsty desperados we're talking about. Rapture's full of poets, artists, tennis players, not hired guerrillas. But this leader, there's this Fontaine. He seems to know his way around the grift. He keeps his nose clean, but not so clean that the right people don't know he's not to be trifled with.
Since goods only attainable from the surface were incredibly sought after, this provided him with the wealth and power he needed to expand his operations to the legitimate commercial, establishing Fontaine Futuristics, as well as Fontaine's Home for the Poor, a charitable front to lure in Rapture's least successful residents.
These sad saps. They come to Rapture thinking they're gonna be captains of industry. But they all forget that somebody's gotta scrub the toilets. What an angle they gave me. I hand these mugs a cot and a bowl of soup, and they give me their lives. Who needs an army when I got Fontaine's Home for the Poor?
Among many things, Fontaine Futuristics pioneered the production of plasmids. These were special serums that modified the body's stem cells, made from a processed material called Adam, which had been discovered was secreted by a species of sea slug unique to the area. The dark and exploitative aspect to this, though, was, as it transpired through medical experimentation, that the only viable hosts for the slug's increased production of Adam were young girls, used as living hosts. These experiments done by a doctor called Bridget Tenenbaum, who'd originally discovered Adam and was funded by Fontaine to do so. To maximise its production, Fontaine set up his Little Sisters Orphanage, from where he abducted girls to turn them into producers of Adam. In addition to this evil, the extended use of plasmids had been found to result in addiction, bodily damage, mental instability and aggression, something the marketing materials never mentioned. The long-term users became known as splicers.
There has been tremendous pressure to regulate this plasmid business. There have been side effects, blindness, insanity, death. But what use is our ideology if it is not tested? The market does not respond like an infant, shrieking at the first sign of displeasure. The market is patient, and we must be too.
Still, with the popularity of these plasmids, Ryan Industries and Fontaine Futuristics were now in competition, with much going on out of the public eye.
Are you in the know? Innovation and competition are what fuel Rapture. But that fuel can be diluted with rumor or flat-out lies. The rumor monger asks, what are these so-called splicing side effects? Well, take a look around you. Do you see anything wrong with your neighbor? The rumor monger asks, why has Tenenbaum withdrawn from the public's eye? Dr. Tenenbaum is a scientific mind unparalleled, even in Rapture. She's no doubt in her lab, toiling away at her next great innovation. I heard she was in cahoots with Fontaine. Merely slander from jealous naysayers. Remember, Rapture competes through innovation, not cheap shots. Bridget Tenenbaum is a woman who represents the best of science and industry. In other words, she's a Rapture gal. Now you know.
In the spirit of unregulated capitalist interests, Ryan assures his confidants that all is well within the system.
Don't come whining to me about market forces, and don't expect me to punish citizens for showing a little initiative. If you don't like what Fontaine is doing, well, I suggest you find a way to offer a better product.
He does come to admit that the lack of regulation has allowed many citizens to be subdued by splicing. However, he remains determined not to become interventionist and act as the state would.
Is there blood in the streets? Of course. Have some chosen to destroy themselves with careless splicing? Undeniable. But I will make no proclamations. I will dictate no laws. The great chain moves slowly, but with wisdom. It is our impatience that invites in the parasite of big government. And once you've invited it in, it will never stop feeding on the body of the city.
Becoming equally jealous of Fontaine's success and more aware of his criminal nature, an investigation is made into his operations.
Something must be done about Fontaine. While I was buying buildings and fish futures, he was cornering the market on genotypes and nucleotide sequences. Rapture is transforming before my eyes. The great chain is pulling away from me. Perhaps it's time to give it a tug.
With criminality overflowing from Fontaine's area of Rapture and Ryan becoming increasingly frustrated, he demands the investigation become more violent and, in spite of his counsel's advice, institutes a death penalty for smuggling.
The death penalty in Rapture. Council's in an uproar. Riots in the streets, they say. But this is the time for leadership. Action must be taken against the smugglers. Any contact with the surface exposes Rapture to the very parasites we fled from. A few stretched necks or a small price to pay for our deals.
As the situation escalated along with Ryan's use of power, some of his confidants began questioning themselves.
Hanging now, is it? That's what we've come to? Now look, I don't make the laws here, I just enforce them. But I didn't come to Rapture to string men up for running contraband. If Ryan and his crew have their law, then they can have my badge.
With methods equally as underhanded as Fontaine, Ryan had now collected enough evidence of his grand smuggling operation, a thing that trespassed one of his most important rules. To end the problem for good, Ryan issued his private police an arrest warrant for Fontaine and an order to break up his smuggling ring. Bill McDonough, one of Ryan's closest confidants and fellow counsellors, suggests limiting any backlash from Fontaine's supporters by leaving his company and holdings untouched after his arrest.
Mr. Ryan, I believe in Rapture, but that doesn't mean we always win. Fontaine Futuristics is the biggest thing going in Rapture, so let me be plain. When we arrest that tow rag Fontaine for his thieving and smuggling, we must make it clear that we won't touch his business interests. We sit on the council because these poor sods trust us, not because God gave us a chair.
Instead of accepting the arrest, Fontaine fights back and dies in the shootout. The poor folk under his sway had been spliced up and likewise fought to the death, inflicting a lot of casualties on Ryan's men.
The good people of Rapture didn't sign up to see us government types shutting down shops, killing their owners, even with a ponce like Fontaine. But he brung it upon himself. Instead of copping it on the chin, bugger gets it into his head that he's gonna go down guns blazing. Who does he think he is, John bloody Wayne? We can get on top of this. We can. Here's what we do. We find Fontaine's will and make what was his go to where it was intended, and not into the pockets of us that put him into the ground.
In retaliation and perhaps greed or some sense of comeuppance, Ryan snubbed the advice of Bill McDonough and the rest of the council, as well as his own principles, by nationalising Fontaine Futuristics. This meant that regardless of the preceding events, he had taken by force what someone else had built.
Are you in the know? You've doubtlessly sampled products from Fontaine Futuristics. But do you know why Ryan Industries saved it? Frank Fontaine, business leader and benefactor of mankind? Or was he the best friend the parasite ever had? Were you aware his businesses were a front for a smuggling ring? And were you also fooled by his supposed charity work? At his free clinic, patients became test subjects, and his orphanages were places that children disappeared into and never came out. Once they learned the truth, Rapture's Central Council called for the arrest of Fontaine Futuristics' owner. But, a coward to the end, Fontaine found a hail of bullets preferable to facing justice. The council asked that Ryan Industries assume the burden of stewardship of Fontaine's ill-gotten assets. And Andrew Ryan accepted that burden for the people of Rapture. Now all citizens can enjoy these products, free of criminal taint. Now you know.
Ryan had agreed to break up and sell off the company to make right, but that was until he discovered the extent of its creations and the potential marketability.
I'll admit Fontaine showed some foresight when he built up the plasmid business, but the man really never understood sales. Hiding those little girls beneath a bushel. I've just seen the preliminary design work on the new plasmid machines, and they're exactly what I wanted. Mark my words, presented properly, those little sisters are marketing gold.
Ryan's dishonesty and opportunism pushed his selfishness beyond reason, even claiming in some altruistic sense that his appropriation of the company was for the good of the city.
Ryan nationalised Fontaine Futuristics. He owns it now, lock, stock and barrel. For the good of the city, he says. He'll break it up in due time, he says. I've resigned from the council and lodged me letter of protest, but that's just pissing in the wind. It'll be war, I say, unless somebody stops Ryan, and right fast.
As order breaks down and the council breaks apart, Ryan attempts to cover for his bad example by way of propaganda.
Are you in the know?
There has been a lot of idle talk from gadflies and naysayers following the nationalization of Fontaine Futuristics. I believe in free men and free markets, but I also believe in my city. And Frank Fontaine's purpose was nothing less than the destruction of Rapture. It was he who gave comfort to the laggards and layabouts. It was he who coddled the tramps and vagabonds. Fontaine was poisoning the people of Rapture. But his venom wasn't made of arsenic or strychnine. No. It was concocted from something far deadlier. It was brewed from altruism.
Now you know.
Unbeknownst to anybody, Frank Fontaine had staged his death with a body double, soon to return with a new identity called Atlas. This new identity had been prepared by posing him as an unseen leader of a growing revolutionary movement, with communistic propagandizing of the city's underclass against Ryan and the many who still adhered to his principles. Ryan had continued the mass production of Adam from the Little Sisters to provide the plasmids needed to meet the demand of the population and to potentially raise an army that could defend him and Rapture from further unrest or exterior threats. Indeed, the yet unseen spectre of Atlas, whose plans were already in motion, had succeeded in raising an army of his own by radicalizing the poor, abandoned and plasmid-addicted underclass.
Never play a man for the short con when you can play him for the long one. Atlas is the longest con of all. Ryan wanted Frank Fontaine dead. I just gave him what he wanted. As Atlas, I got a new face, a clean record, and a fresh start. Now, it's time to take back Rapture.
Lisa, please.
Oh, Mrs. McClintock, what are you doing here? Let me just turn this off.
On New Year's Eve 1958, Atlas set off a bomb targeted at Rapture's high society and launched attacks throughout the city. An outright civil war had begun.
Strikes me that Fontaine wasn't overly inconvenienced by his own demise. On New Year's Eve, these wretched splicers come streaming out of the poorhouses and stormed the proverbial barricades. They're dead rot in the streets, and Johnny and Janie Citizen are lined up round the block for plasmids. Anything to help fend off the rabble.
Ryan knew now that Atlas and his revolutionaries were an existential threat to what he had built, and wasn't willing to attempt any negotiations. He now began creating an army of his own with the resources Fontaine Futuristics had provided for further plasmid experimentation.
I begged Mr. Ryan to hand Fontaine Futuristics over to Atlas's boys as a peace offering, but the stupid sod won't listen to reason. Instead, he's just splicing his mob up, giving them more and tougher plasmids. There's an arms race on here in Rapture, but it's not about who can build the best guns and the biggest bombs. It's about who can become less of a man and more of a monster.
After much fighting led to a stalemate, Ryan funded a pheromone modification of the plasmids being sold to his people that allowed for him to fully control their inhibitions, hijacking their free will for his own.
Dr. Suchong, frankly, I'm shocked by your proposal. If we were to modify the structure of our commercial plasmid line as you propose, to have them make the user vulnerable to mental suggestion through pheromones, would we not be able to effectively control the actions of the citizens of Rapture? Free will is the cornerstone of this city. The thought of sacrificing it is abhorrent. However, we are indeed in a time of war. If Atlas and his bandits have their way, will they not turn us into slaves? And what will become of free will then? Desperate times call for desperate measures.
Finally admitting some remorse for what has come to be, particularly for the Little Sisters, Ryan attempts to reason away his guilt.
The children, with their very long needles, their tuneless songs, their ghastly errands, their ghoulish Frankenstein fathers. But we've all placed our hand on the great chain of endeavor. My hand is on it. Fontaine's is on it. We all pull it and are pulled by it. Yes, these children are an abomination. But it is not my hand alone on the chain that created them. No. Their little fingers were right there, next to mine.
Momentarily, he reflects upon his actions and beliefs.
Could I have made mistakes? One does not build cities if one is guided by doubt. But can one govern in absolute certainty? I know that my beliefs have elevated me just as I know that the things I have rejected would have destroyed me. But the city is collapsing before my eyes. Have I become so convinced by my own beliefs that I have stopped seeing the truth? Perhaps. But Atlas is out there, and he aims to destroy me and to destroy my city. To question is to surrender. I will not question.
As a final long play aiming to win the war, the endlessly deceptive Atlas triggered his ace in the hole, this being a devious backup plan where he'd purchased Jack, the unborn child of Ryan and his mistress, then rapidly aged and brainwashed into following his orders, sent up to the surface, all to await a trigger phrase. The airplane crash at the start of the game turns out to be the doing of the unwitting Jack, having been called back by Atlas. The genetic match between Andrew Ryan and Jack allows him to make use of Rapture's systems that are genetically locked. This uniquely allows Jack to access the area his father is holding out in and end the war by killing him on Atlas's behalf. A grave mistake by Andrew Ryan in unknowingly letting in one's sole adversary of worth without moral scruples, a condition set by a system of his own creation, a population mostly of his choosing, precipitated the fall of Rapture. His actions were as important as anyone else's in this fate. Realising he had become so compromised and conflicted in the penultimate moment before his looming death, without the ability to fight or the want to flee, he could only exhaust the last of his will upon proving a beleaguered, dogged point.
Even in the Book of Lies, sometimes you find truth. There is indeed a season for all things. And now that I see you flesh to flesh and blood to blood, I know I cannot raise my hand against you. But know this, you are my greatest disappointment. Does your master hear me? Atlas, you can kill me, but you will never have my city. My strength is not in steel and fire. That is what the parasites will never understand. A season for all things. A time to live and a time to die. A time to build and a time to destroy! Come now, my child. There is one final thing to discuss.
The assassin has overcome my final defense, and now he's come to murder me. In the end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys. Was a man sent to kill, or a slave? A man chooses. A slave obeys. Come in. Stop, would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Sit, would you kindly? Stand, would you kindly? Run! Stop! Turn. A man chooses. A slave obeys. Kill! A man chooses! A slave obeys! Obey!
For Ryan, of most importance was returning to the ideological base point that man had free will, and that all else followed. It was this thing that differentiated man from mere animals, and which differentiated a man from a slave. While the player's character was uncontrollably beholden to the will of another, Atlas, even in death, Ryan chose. In some tortured way, in adherence to his objectivist principles, his final act was rationally considered and on his terms.
I believed in this place. I believed in Ryan. But when it got hard, Ryan didn't believe in Rapture, didn't believe in the Great Chain. He believed in power. And now this place is busto.
Ryan is at first akin to Rand's hero characters like Atlas Shrugg's John Galt and the Fountainhead's Howard Rourke, uncompromisingly independent, capable and clever. The twist in Bioshock, however, is that his story is fated with compromise and tragedy. And what the game's writers could do that Ayn Rand could not was make that a comparison with her.